All right, I think we can get started with today's webinar. So thank you all for coming to the first installment of the Yarr Summer Series. Today's presentation will be on the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, or PDUFA. And this is sort of highlights from the rare disease community, especially in the draft House Energy and Commerce legislation, and also now the Senate draft that has come out. Really quickly, I want to take a moment to thank our presenting sponsor for all three of the Summer Series webinars, Travere Therapeutics, making stuff like this possible for us to do. I also just want to do some quick housekeeping with folks before the full webinar starts. Closed captioning is available in real time. There's a CC button on the bottom of your window. You can see it in the little image on the screen, and you can click that to show subtitles or see the full transcript. Please use the Q&A box during the presentation to submit any questions you have. We'll open for more questions at the end and have some discussion about PDUFA with the two speakers. So if you have anything as you go along, we'll be able to see that in the Q&A box. And then finally, you'll see that today's webinar is being recorded. We'll post this online once it's available, but do know that just if you're asking questions or anything throughout the webinar. With that, I'm going to pass it to Dan and Abby to introduce themselves and get started.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to thank you all for coming today. My name is Dan Pezzetta. I'm a Yarr member, RDLA intern. For me, my connection to rare disease, I have aortic stenosis, something that I've had since birth. And in the last couple of years, I've found a lot of love and passion getting into rare disease legislation and policy. And I've been continuing pursuing that through going to graduate school at George Washington for legislative affairs, where I could hope to help continue making a difference for our entire community, because I really appreciate all of you.
And I'm Abbey Hauser. I am a Yarr member, and I am also on the board of directors for the Every Life Foundation. And I have been participating with Yarr for a few years, and I am a patient who has classical Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and has been advocating in that space for almost 20 years now. And I'm really excited that you're here for this topic. It's not always the most exciting, but I'm glad that you're taking the time to be here. Next slide.
So yeah, I'm going to help give you all a rundown on what we're going to be doing today with our Prescription Drug User Fee Act, or as I'm going to just call it from now on, PDUFA, which is a fun way to say it, I think, personally. So the couple things that we're going to go through our rundown throughout our entire time. Abbey has come up with an amazing metaphor to explain PDUFA in a great way that we're going to continue throughout our entire time. We're actually going to introduce it in our next slide. I will be going over the history of PDUFA and what user fees are, which is actually a very interesting thing as well. User fees can definitely be misconstrued. And then the timeline Abbey will be able to give of a current reauthorization, which is on the board for this year, as well as information concerning what it is about, and then how y'all can get involved, and some closing remarks by Yarr. And if you ever see any red text at all, those are words or phrases or anything that may not be known by everyone, and we want to be sure to explain it whether on that slide itself or it'll be explained later on. So those are things to always keep an eye out and always pay attention to. Next slide.
All right, so this is the beginning of the metaphor. It gets carried on later throughout this presentation, but this was created out of a question that I actually asked someone on the policy team at Every Life, where I was confused by why all these different topics fit into this one bill. Because when it's called Prescription Drug User Fee Act, I think of prescription drugs as when I pick them up at the pharmacy. I think of the end result. And I was forgetting all the steps that went into that beforehand. And basically, PDUFA, what we kind of came up with is the drug itself, the treatment, the drug, whatever you want to call it, that you might pick up as a prescription drug, is a house. And PDUFA is sort of the blueprint to how we get there. So it's how we create this house, how we get these drugs developed, how we regulate that process, and how we sort of just continue improving this process in a timely manner so that we can get drugs developed quickly and safely and effectively. So we'll be carrying this sort of throughout that, but that's where this metaphor came from, is that there's so much more than just picking up something at the pharmacy in PDUFA itself. So again, you'll see this a little bit later, but Dan right now will take you into the history of user fees and sort of how we got to where we are today now. On the next slide.
So yeah, before we go absolutely straight into the history, I do want to explain to y'all what PDUFA is, because knowing the perfect metaphor and hearing the name of what the act is vital, but actually knowing what it does is also super important. So the first time this passed into law was in 1992, and every 5 years has passed, and we are currently in a position where it does have to pass by the end of this year. And the reason why we have it every 5 years is something that I'll explain further on, and it actually makes a whole lot of sense once you hear it. So basically, this law supplements the FDA with critical resources through user fees. And user fees can be kind of confusing in a sense. It almost sounds like we are the ones paying for it because we're the users of these drugs. But in actuality, it's not that case. It's actually the biopharmaceutical companies that help support the FDA, and it helps bring up their infrastructure so that way they have more budget, more funding, more ability to actually get money into having a faster process and creating more drugs, into trying drugs that aren't as wildly needed by the general population of people. And the FDA does set target review timelines to be able to compete for completing a product. And that is for 10 months for a standard review and 6 months for priority for anything that needs to get done desperately in terms of that. And since PDUFA has been passed in 1992, we have seen some of the biggest surges in innovation and productivity from creating drugs that are going to help hundreds and thousands of people. Next slide. So PDUFA's foundation was long ago, and that has to go with user fees. So the idea of user fees wasn't something that just came about with the FDA. It was actually something that was floated around in many different parts of the United States government since the 50s, and it was something that was incredibly difficult to figure out how it was actually going to work. Not only on the equity side of things, where in terms of who's getting what funding and from where, but also a lot of fear within the government in terms of certain groups being favored by others or not being able to track who's getting user fees and why they're getting them. And it was something that was becoming a very contentious problem within the government. And while this idea sounded great on paper and there was a lot of support, the idea wasn't quite there. So the beginning of our foundation of our house was starting to get there. Unfortunately, it was something that could not be implemented throughout the 50s. And I think it's something that's important to realize too, that this wasn't something a lot of people kind of credit, like a bill passed in 1992 must meant that it was a current problem. This is a problem that's been persisting for decades, and it took a lot of time to kind of figure out all of the processes of it. And I think that's something that is truly unique and interesting, especially considering the fact that the FDA nearly went a whole decade without user fees and was running really well and really fine. However, it needed its extra push, and a lot of other organizations needed that extra push. And that's why in 1959, the Bureau of Budget created kind of like an informal thing in terms of it wasn't actual law that was passed. It was more of like, this is something called Circular A25. And Circular A25 created more of a groundwork and a standardization of what user fees are, who can use them, how they can use them, what they can do, everything in that process. So it basically kind of created this almost the beginning of this idea of how we're going to build the structure with user fees. So it created this beginning idea for each organization, which eventually would lead to the FDA using it. Next slide. So you may be wondering right now why there are two Supreme Court cases that have absolutely nothing to do with drugs. There's a power company and a television company versus some part of the United States, or the entirety of the United States as our second one. So these two cases both happened in 1974, weirdly enough. And these two different Supreme Court cases helped codify 825 into actual law. So the idea of codifying is something that it hasn't necessarily become a law, or it was something that had done maybe only in the states in a state, for example. And it basically made it that it was actual law throughout the entire government. Certain things like the legalization of gay marriage happened through the Supreme Court because it codified other laws that happened in other states. So basically, it set the idea that user fees were constitutional and that they were able to be used. And it decided that as long as there were identifiable beneficiaries, so basically the identifiable beneficiary, it had to be public knowledge as to who was giving you money and why they were giving you money. So it was basically this idea of how people can have trust within user fees and that they couldn't be abused by people that wanted to take advantage for any number of reasons. It also created a distinction between actual versus potential beneficiaries. So the FDA is actually a potential beneficiary because people are using those user fees. The FDA is using those user fees so that way they can have the potential to create drugs that are going to help people, versus actual is like they need the money and they can get this one thing done guaranteed no matter what. So it's the idea of potential versus the actual. And it also deemed that using user fees was a necessary government function, which opened the door for any federal government agency to be able to use user fees. Next slide. So you may be wondering, the idea of if the FDA could now use user fees in 1974, why didn't they? And what happened throughout the 80s that caused a lot of tumultuous problems in and out of the control of the FDA? So the FDA had a structure and their house was going pretty well for a long time. Since 1906 was when the FDA was first created, and it was going really strong. However, a lot of things started appearing and a lot of things kept compounding upon each other, which caused this house that they currently had to start to crumble a little bit. And they had to start fixing up a new blueprint for a new house. And we are going to go over some of these problems that caused the initial structure to start crumbling a little bit. Next slide. So the FDA throughout the 80s, there was a lot of different problems, and they couldn't just implement user fees off the bat. So the very first problem was the equity problem, which happened throughout the 1950s as well when this was first discussed. And that was particularly shown around orphan drugs. So for those of you who don't know, orphan drugs are basically drugs for groups, people with certain illnesses that it's a very rare condition, rare diseases that don't really have any or none at all treatments or drugs or anything. So creating a equity that would help people help funding towards orphan drugs, as well as keeping it equitable and up there with the same amount of budget as with drugs that for diseases that are considered not as rare. The second thing is the Grace Commission in 1981 is a 21,000-page document, and unfortunately, I did not have time to read all of it before. However, the basic gist of the Grace Commission is basically telling the FDA how user fees would impact the competitiveness, the employment, the profitability of the FDA if they use user fees, and how it would create competition, anything of that sorts, and kind of gives them the pros and cons list of using user fees moving forward. And that kind of created this rift of leadership throughout the FDA, where there was a lot of belief that user fees would not help recoup the overall costs that they had. So that was something that was also debated heavily. So while there wasn't the user fees yet, there was a lot of issues in terms of if it was equitable, if it was something to be used. And that was something that we had continuously seen in the past. However, the big thing that came forward was the HIV/AIDS epidemic happened in the 1980s. And that was something that showed how underfunded and unfortunate the FDA was put in a position where they couldn't really have the budget to really review drug processes, to use user fees at all, really. And it was something that incredibly hurt Americans throughout our entire country. And there was a lot of unfortunate people who passed away due to that. And then before PDUFA, the FDA was given a budget through appropriations, and strong opposition, especially from people like Senator Ted Kennedy, prevented user fees from going above 25%. So basically the user fees back then were given through appropriations rather than the FDA had full control over how those user fees were worked. Ted Kennedy especially, he believed that the FDA is supposed to be beholden to the people, and that way they are supposed to be the ones giving the budget, which was his belief as to why appropriations should give it. However, their budget was incredibly minuscule. So through user fees only, they could get only about 200 million, and their entire budget was 971 million, which I don't know the exact conversions, but 971 million in 1992 is still an incredibly low budget. Next slide. So this new blueprint needed to be realized. And a lot of people throughout the 80s, with all of those problems that I described, realized that these issues are going to continue getting worse and if we don't address this problem. So they started restructuring the FDA and how user fees could be properly implemented within the FDA. Next slide. So the obvious change was needed, and former people that oppose it, such as Ted Kennedy, realized the error in believing what he formerly believed. And he used this very funny tagline that kind of became the calling cry for it, of good medicines were good for patients, which seems very obvious and really makes me laugh every time I try to say it, because it's just that ridiculous in the sense of, yeah, it's that obvious. And it easily passed through the House and Senate. However, President Bush, he really supported it. However, like I said before, people have a hard distinction between user fee and taxes. And when you hear user fee, the immediate reaction is, oh, this is going to affect me. So President Bush famously said, read my lips, no new taxes. And a lot of people were holding him to that. And if he signed something that said user fee, people may misconstrue it. So he literally signed it the day before the election against Bill Clinton. So that way he can kind of like tuck it under so people wouldn't notice. He still lost anyway. And then they decided a 5-year lifespan for each PDUFA. And the reason why is that new amendments and passages were more appropriate with the times needed at the time. So basically, so it needs to meet the needs of the people. And that's the importance of the FDA and the importance of PDUFA. And they recognize that, and that every 5 years, there may be new needs for people, or a new idea or concept that hasn't been addressed yet, or something that was kind of addressed, but they didn't address it in the right way, perhaps. So that way they have this ability to easily readjust it, make new additions, anything like that. So that is why there is a 5-year lifespan for each PDUFA. Next slide. So the things that have been added in our PDUFAs have been very important. So extended user fees to preclinical and clinical development. So basically any of the clinical trials moving forward were able to be funded by user fees, which was great. PDUFA 3 extended user fees to a 3-year post-approval. So once drugs were actually approved and being used, there could be a lot of study in terms of the 3 years, being able to analyze how it worked, if there were anything that they may not have recognized. PDUFA 4 extended user fees to post-approval for the lifetime of any product. So that way there can continue to be long-term, not just the 3-year, which allowed more observation and more study towards drugs that were passed. And then PDUFA 5 was the birth of patient-focused drug development, which is more or less what we're doing, in a sense of patients have a very strong say in what their drug development needs and what problems are facing within their community, and a lot of wonderful things that we're able to be in the forefront of advocating and being a part of the drug development process, rather than kind of being acknowledged as someone that needs to be a part of it, but rather not a part of it. Next slide. And to end my part of it, I just wanted to say the approval rate for drugs that the FDA has passed has gone from 23% to 80% since the passage of PDUFA 1. And that is that is incredibly great, on the sense of we have given this opportunity for more drugs to be developed, more opportunity for drugs to be a part of communities that never had drugs or treatments before, and more drugs are being readily available and out there for people. And it's done tremendous help for so many different communities, both in the non-rare disease side or the rare disease side. And it's something that is so vital to be passed. So the history, I hope you all learned so much, because I had so much fun researching all of this and writing it down. I felt like such a little nerd. I loved it. It was great. And now I get to pass it off to Abby in terms of the current PDUFA and how that is going to be looking forward. And Abby is amazing with it, so I'll pass it off to her.
Thank you, Dan. I hope that background sort of helped, I think, in order to understand why we're even calling PDUFA a user fee bill and why all this stuff fits into something called user fees. It's important to understand sort of how they came about in the FDA and how they just were able to help the FDA shorten that approval time for drugs by increasing their staffing and just the money that they have available to get drugs on the market and to patients quicker. So from there, we're going to move into PDUFA VII, which is what we are calling our current reauthorization cycle. And like Dan said, PDUFA needs to be reauthorized every 5 years. And we're going to kind of keep repeating that throughout this thing, because PDUFA is a piece of legislation that we're going to be engaging with as advocates every 5 years for the foreseeable future and potentially for the rest of our lives. So that's why I think it's really important to understand it and sort of embrace the challenge that is PDUFA. And within this, the process is led by 2 committees in the House and Senate. And specifically where this sort of falls into is that a committee is like a smaller group of the Senate that covers specific topics. They have different jurisdictions. And they're able to review, draft, and recommend legislation to the larger Senate or House. So PDUFA itself falls under the Senate, what's known as the HELP Committee, which stands for the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. And then in the House, it falls under the Energy and Commerce Committee, which sounds a little bit funny because the word health is not right in the title, but that's just where this piece falls in. And specifically, PDUFA VII must be completed by September 30th, 2022, but we're really hoping that it gets done much before that. Next slide. So like we talked about, we need to update this blueprint. And the way that we're able to update the blueprint for our specific PDUFA VII this year is that the user fees are able to sort of shape policy by calling for the FDA and a group called the Government Accountability Office, or the GAO, to conduct studies and hold workshops. And now the GAO is a group that's sometimes called like the investigative arm of Congress, and they're just really there for kind of the checks and balances and to make sure that Congress is holding up their constitutional responsibilities. And a lot of the things within the user fee bills go together with FDA and GAO. So you might see both of those acronyms as we go along. And the draft bills right now, we're only talking about the drafts of these bills because they haven't been finalized or anything yet. So again, these are all drafts, but they include policy and several requirements that will result in reports and other things that will go to Congress to continue guiding them to make future PDUFAs or other user fee agreements, and then just to give results of these new policies that we're implementing throughout this whole process. Next slide. So before we get into the current status of where the current state of the drafts are, we kind of need to look at how we got to this exact point today. And the reauthorization starts many years before the deadline. So this current reauthorization started in July 2020, which is when the FDA invites non-industry stakeholders, such as advocacy groups, healthcare professionals, and other experts, to participate in some consultation meetings that revolve around center around a set of various topics. And then they kind of continue those meetings monthly through almost August 2021. And then FDA does then begin negotiations with industry. And in this rare space or the medical space, industry is often the drug companies, the biopharmaceutical companies, those types of places are what's considered industry, and then everyone else might be non-industry. And this image on the right is directly from the FDA's PDUFA VII website that we all have access to. And it only shows like all these blue titles are just 2 months worth of industry discussions on PDUFA VII. So there's a lot that's going on, and we have access to all the results of these meetings and documents. So I just wanted to make sure that we're all kind of seeing what some of these documents look like more in real time, as opposed to being abstract concepts. Next slide. So from late August 2021, something called a commitment letter was released. And that's sort of the beginning step of this PDUFA legislative process. So a commitment letter is something that sets forth the sort of a framework or just a group of policies and more specific goals that they are committing to within the FDA on this PDUFA. And this is always the first step. This commitment letter is the result of those almost year plus of meetings. And that's what they're putting forth. And it usually goes into a lot more detail than some of these draft bills might. And then they go for some feedback again from the public. There's a public workshop, and then there's a written comment period that happened in September. And then they kind of get all that together. They finalize their commitment letter. And then in January 2022, that was sent to Congress. And only then is Congress able to start the legislative process. And then from January 2022, they have until September 30th to pass the user fee bill. And this image on the right is the first page of the PDUFA VII commitment letter. It's not very exciting. It really is just like the table of contents in a very short span. But again, I wanted to make sure that we're looking at these documents and recognizing what they look like. Next slide. So step one ended up being, just by who came out with their draft first, was the House Energy and Commerce user fee package. And I know we haven't quite covered some of this yet, but there are many user fee packages or user fee bills that kind of have specific categories. So we're covering PDUFA here, which is the prescription drugs, but there's also ones for generics, generic drugs, medical devices, biosimilars. So all of those get put into one package, but we're looking at the specific part that is the prescription drug part. So on May 4th, the House Energy and Commerce finally released their first complete draft. So again, from January until May, they got that draft finally released. And then on May 11th, there's a smaller group within that HELP committee, or within the ENC committee, who marked up the bill, which is just a fancy way of saying they discussed it, they maybe made some changes, they edited it, maybe added some amendments. And then from that subcommittee, it gets passed out, and then they do a second markup, so a second edit, if that makes more sense to you, on May 18th. And then from there, that bill was reported out of committee favorably to the grander group of the House of Representatives. Next slide. And the most up-to-date thing that's happening with this is the Senate Help Committee just came out with their draft. They just released it not too long ago. May 27th was not that many, like a week and a half ago maybe, and they completed their same drafts following that same process. It will also follow a markup period within the committee before it can get reported out to the larger Senate. However, this Senate draft did contain more limited rare disease priorities than the House package did. So a lot of what we'll be talking about in the coming slides will be about the House package, just because we've had our hands on that one longer. But we'll kind of be discussing what maybe might have been left out of the Senate one and what we're kind of hoping to still see. Because ultimately these differences need to be resolved before the legislation can move forward as one piece of legislation between the two groups. Next slide. Okay, so now we're really going to dive into our analogy here, and that each unshaded area that comes up in the coming slides will be the area that we're focusing on. And the first one is program reauthorizations. Next slide. So PDUFA has the authority or the ability to expand and reauthorize existing programs, and it also has the ability to establish new policy or new programs. And one specific thing that matters to our rare disease community is the reauthorization of the Orphan Drug Grants Program, which is especially important for funding natural history studies, which is a study that looks at sort of the natural course of a disease in a population in the absence of an intervention. So it's basically just looking at how the disease functions in the population, which is really important for researchers to gather data on how the disease looks in people as opposed to just in a clinical setting. And it also helps fund clinical trials for rare diseases and expands on this current one. And there is language right here that you can see in the second bullet point that just says it's for developing regulatory science, but basically it's for rare diseases or conditions. And that is essentially what the Orphan Drug Grants Program is on its own. Next slide. And now a new program that was presented in this House draft was something that's pretty cool, and it's called the Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Pilot. So that's a new program with the goal of establishing procedures to provide increased interaction with sponsors of rare drugs. And this is where some of the language gets really weird, because a sponsor of a rare drug is basically what you might consider like a drug company or a pharmaceutical company. If you think of it, they're like sponsoring the drug to get made. And that's the language that we will continue using throughout this, but it is the drug companies are the sponsors. And this program is hoping to advance some of these endpoints and how we look at the end results of rare disease research and clinical trials. But the bigger scope of this pilot was detailed in that commitment letter that I said usually has a lot more policy and commitments within it. But it just involves some meetings, some reporting to Congress on the outcomes of this pilot program, And hopefully guidance comes out of this on how we can continue developing some of these rare disease aspects of research specifically. So we're hoping we can get this into the Senate bill, or that it makes its way into the Senate companion, but right now it was not. Next slide. And the next one involves, again, weird language that we're not used to hearing kind of on the patient side, but it is communication with payers. Next slide. And a payer, just like how a sponsor was a drug company, the payer is an insurance company, essentially, because they are the ones who are paying for the most money of that access. Patients do pay on the other side of it, but generally insurance is also paying on that side. So they are considered payers in things like this. And if you don't have a treatment approved for your condition, you might not be familiar with a big downfall of an approved treatment is that there's a lot of delay that can happen after approval. So it gets approved by the FDA, but then there's a delay in getting access. So we've got the approval, but we can't get it into our hands as patients. And the biggest reason for this is that the payers, so the insurance companies, take time to review the data and determine the coverage policies before getting approval. And this happens after the drug has been approved. So the insurance companies still have to decide if they want to approve coverage, even though it's already been approved by the FDA, and then they have to decide how much they are going to cover. And this all has to happen currently after the approval happens. And hopefully in PDUFA VII, if we can get that language in there, it would establish some criteria for drug companies to allow them clear instructions on what information they can potentially send to the insurance companies ahead of time while the drug is still in this approval process, which means it just means we're giving the insurance companies a little bit more data. We're giving the payers that data so that they can start that decision-making process before the approval gets completed, so that when it is completed, it's hopefully a little bit quicker of a time into patients' hands, which is what we all want, especially with a lot of rare diseases who just cannot afford to wait for that access once the treatment is approved. Next slide. The next one is accelerated approval, which is actually a topic that we have two great speakers speaking on next month at our Yarr summer series. But there are some language around accelerated approval within PDUFA, so we're just going to cover it briefly here, but they're going to do a really great job in July covering it as well. Next slide. So a little bit of a background is just accelerated approval allows the FDA to use a surrogate endpoint, or it could be an immediate endpoint depending on the condition, to evaluate the safety and efficacy of therapies for essentially rare diseases or serious conditions that do not have a current need that is being met. And a surrogate endpoint is a fancy term for saying it's something that we're using to predict clinical benefit as means to essentially get that treatment into the patient's hands sooner. And then you're able to go back and confirm the results from that surrogate endpoint after you've already gotten the drug into patients' hands. So ongoing research is still being conducted, but if you're on the trajectory to show a good approval, it allows us to just get that accelerated a little bit while you're still finishing that data collection. Again, with the goal of getting the treatments safely into patients' hands as quick as possible. Next slide. And in PDUFA VII, there's some changes to this accelerated approval pathway, but essentially it's just on tightening some of the current requirements that have to do with reporting, the confirmatory trial timelines, which is just the trials that you're confirming that surrogate endpoint or that the predicted result actually became true, and then tightening up some procedures on withdrawing an approval for the accelerated approval pathway. Next slide. And then one that we're really excited about the presence of in this House bill is the clinical trial diversity. Next slide. So PDUFA VII includes brand new policy that aims to improve the diversity of clinical trial participants, with the seemingly very obvious goal that a clinical trial should be tested in a population that more closely matches the real world population that will be using the treatment. And the language that we put in, or that was put into this policy, pulls from some other pieces of legislation that have been out there for a little bit. One especially called the DEPICT Act, which basically it's just having the sponsor, again, the drug companies, to submit diversity action plans for their clinical trials. And then requires the FDA to release guidance on these action plans so that there's some standardization for what should belong inside of these plans. Next slide. And we also have something that just really kind of boomed in this pandemic, which is called decentralized trials. And I really like in this metaphor that we were able to put it outside of the house, because a decentralized trial is, as you'll see, it's something that takes place out of the traditional setting of a trial. Next slide. So before we get into what a decentralized trial is, we kind of need to define what real world evidence is. And both of these terms, honestly, are very straightforward. If you just read them, you probably already know what I'm about to say. But real world evidence is evidence that is collected outside of the traditional clinical trial environment. It comes from the real world, and it has just a lot of potential to provide insights into how treatments work in our actual day-to-day lives. And just outside of that clinical setting, we're able to implement a little bit better. And our data collection that we've been able to get, especially that boomed in the pandemic, has really increased the use of this real world evidence. So PDUFA VII specifically has language in it, especially in this House draft, to address the use of real world evidence and then facilitate how we can advance using a decentralized trial, which is a clinical trial that includes either completely or partially activities or data collection that happens just outside of the traditional clinical trial site location. And essentially it's using some real world evidence, or it's just using evidence that is being sent to someone's home with a test collection kit or something like that as a means to do that. And this is a great reason for why we reauthorize PDUFA every 5 years, because 5 years ago, we couldn't have predicted that this is where we would have been with our trials, and that we were having people complete clinical trials over a global pandemic at home and different things like that. So now we're able to start putting those into policy and shaping the creation and just firming up how we use it and make it a little bit more structured in that sense from here on out before the next one. Next slide. And lastly, we have sort of a broad rare disease category that just sort of covers things that didn't quite fit into some other topics and some things that we were hoping to see into PDUFA VII, but that have not quite made it into a draft yet. Next slide. And before we completely go into how the rare disease priorities were included, or the ones that we wanted included weren't included, we kind of need to explain why some of these priorities get added in. So I don't know if we've said it before in this presentation, but if you've been into other presentations on PDUFA, you might have heard that it's called a must-pass piece of legislation. And because it's a must-pass piece of legislation, it also becomes what's called a vehicle for advancing some other policies that communities have been working on for years, kind of in between the reauthorizations. So a vehicle is kind of a common term that we're using, but essentially it allows PDUFA, especially PDUFA VII, to be a way to get some of these priorities that we've been trying to get passed separately and just is not making as much progress into a bill, because this one will pass and it needs to pass by September 30th, 2022. So there's some chances to get some specific priorities sort of added into this bill. Next slide. So because of that, we were really hoping to see two sort of really big priorities in the rare disease community that we've been working on for a while here. And unfortunately, they were not added to either the Senate or the House draft. And those were the creation of the Rare Disease Center of Excellence and also a Rare Disease and Condition Advisory Committee at the FDA. And if that language sounds familiar to you, that's because it's language that's taken directly from the Speeding Therapy Access Today Act, or the STAT Act, which I know many of us advocated for at Rare Disease Week and other events. So we were kind of hoping that maybe it might have been included within PDUFA VII as a priority, as a means to hopefully try to get that moving along. But unfortunately, it was not at this time. And then we were also hoping that there'd be a strengthening consideration of patient and caregiver experience data in a lot of the product reviews within the FDA. And this language comes from the Benefit Act that I know I advocated for at Rare Disease Week, and I think a few other Yarrs did as well. So we were definitely hoping to see some more consideration of that within it. But so far, those are not in either drafts, and we're not really sure where that's going to move towards, but we're hoping to see at least just some continued engagement within these policies. Next slide. So what's next? There's still several steps to get to the finish line. As I've said, we've pretty much got the House. They've got their draft. The Senate is in the middle of marking up their draft. They have not presented it to the entire Senate yet. And their markup was listed on their committee's website as happening today. But usually then sometimes there's another comment period, or there's still a lot of work to be done before they all vote on it favorably out to the Senate. And then both drafts still need to end up matching before multiple areas of floor activity happen, and that there can be a final vote to get it passed out. But what this means is that there might be several steps for you as advocates to still get involved. So what we're really hoping is that even if none of this in this 1 hour made sense to you, or if just all you learned is that it's an important piece of legislation for a lot of advancement in our community, that's enough information for you to be able to take action with your local federal legislator. And the best way that you can do this will be shown to you on the next slide. So the best way that you can take action is to join the RDLA action alerts. So if you're not signed up for these, if you've never gotten one in the past, then you're likely not signed up for them. They're definitely separate than just like a regular RDLA email or a regular Every Life email. They usually are when there's a policy issue that we would like you to take action on. They guide you through it in this lovely email on how to contact your senator, your representative, and sort of the language that we're looking for. So this QR code on the screen with the little dinosaur actually takes you right to the RDLA page. And from there, you'll see this lovely red Take Action button at the top. And you'll click that, and that will bring you to a list of our current federal campaigns that we're working on. And to the right of all that information is a little box that says sign up for alerts. And if you click that, type in your email and your zip code, because sometimes it's location based and that's helpful. And then you click enter and you will be added on to our action alerts. And from there, if we need any help with PDUFA, if we want you to reach out to your representative or your senator, that will be shared through an action alert, and other Yarr will also help spread the word on that. But what I find most interesting about PDUFA is that we just get to engage with it every 5 years. And we don't get to say that about almost any other piece of legislation. So this is the one that it's really worthwhile taking time to understand where your voice can be heard and that your voice matters on these issues, because whether you have a rare disease or just a chronic medical condition, PDUFA has influenced your ability to access drugs in the past and in the future. And this is kind of the bill that we can do it. So we might as well start engaging with it now, even though it feels like a terrifying topic. I know that we all have the skill set to be able to follow and engage with it. And I'm very excited that a bunch of you showed up today to at least learn about it, and that we can continue moving forward with PDUFA VII. And with that, I give it back to Courtney for some programming reminders.
Thank you so much, Abby. That was really great. And thank you so much, Dan, as well, just for the whole overview of PDUFA. This is just very helpful for everyone. This actually follows very well from Abby's last slide around some of the content with how to get involved and how to take action with the knowledge that y'all have picked up at least a little bit of tonight. Rare Across America is one of our big advocacy events, and registration is currently open. Rare Across America this year will stretch from August 8th to August 19th. So all of the legislative meetings will take place during that time period. And this is really a chance for you to make an impact during the congressional recess when your federal legislator is home in their own district over that August break. Essentially, they're not at their Washington, D.C. office. They're at some of the offices that are closer to you in whatever state or territory you live in. So it's a chance to get to also build relationships with some of those staffers in local offices and get to talk to them in an area that matters to you both. It's also a chance to share your rare disease story and to make an ask that's important to you. And you can meet some other rare disease advocates, talk about PDUFA priorities, talk about some of how this looks. This year, it'll be hybrid, so all of the House meetings will be in person at that local district office. All of the Senate meetings will be virtual. You can sign up for either or both. So if you only want to do in-person meetings, you can do that. If you only want to do virtual meetings, you can do that. And if you really want to do both, you can also do that. I added the website here, so you can either look it up or take a screenshot or picture of this page if you just need something to be able to come back to this. Would love to see some people advocating a little bit for some of our priorities in PDUFA and other important rare disease community legislation there. I will also add that you can come to some of the hinted at summer series presentations that will be occurring. The next one is on accelerated approval. That will be Thursday, July 14th at 6 p.m. Eastern time. That will feature Carter and Laura, whose headshots you can see at the bottom, who've both been doing a lot of research about accelerated approval and other specialty FDA pathways, talking about how drugs are actually developed and reviewed sort of in the process that is often informed by user fees. It all connects. We'll also have one on Wednesday, August 10th at 6 p.m. Eastern time. That will be more advocacy focused than a policy deep dive. And that will be all on using LinkedIn as a rare disease advocate, especially a young adult advocate. How is it that you talk about some of your advocacy, volunteer or otherwise? How do you sort of describe some of the gaps that you might have because of living with a rare disease? How do you just facilitate having the best LinkedIn presence possible for some of your advocacy? The link is also here. Again, take a picture. You can find all of this on the Yarr website under some of the tabs. And I encourage you to register for both of these as well. Stick with me here. We have a few extra updates. For those of you who are current Yarr members, we have the next round of our Speakers Bureau occurring in mid to late July. So it's coming up. Registration is open now, so you can sign up for that. And as a little reminder, the Speakers Bureau includes two-hour trainings to improve your public speaking skills with a relatively small group of other Yarr members so you can get to know each other and provide feedback. We'll also have roundtable practice sessions again, where you'll have 5 to 7 minutes to practice your own story and give feedback on other people's presentations. And then Lindsay and I will help support folks with virtual presentation skills, modules, prep, and also matching you to speaking engagements, like, for example, some of the summer series that you're watching. Folks who've been through the Speakers Bureau have sort of done this before. And there are some logos here just of events that people have spoken at who've recently gone through the Speakers Bureau. This will be the last Speakers Bureau cohort of 2022. Before we kick off, little spoiler for the next slide, the Leadership Academy. So there'll be another one in 2023, but this is sort of your last chance if you want to start working on some of that public speaking skills now. And then, of course, we have our Young Adult YA Coalition. If you're involved in a patient organization that has a group focused on young adults or that entirely focuses on young adults, or if you're part of a college club or group that focuses on rare disease, chronic illness, if you're interested in collaborating with other groups, being aware of other events, being able to learn about best practices and coordinate with each other, join the YA Coalition. We've been having meetings regularly, 3 times a year. We have one set for later in June. And if you're interested in more information on that, if that's the right fit, you can email Lindsay, so lcundiff, C-U-N-D-I-F-F, at everylifefoundation.org. And you can find some of this online as well under the Yarr section. And then finally, hinted at, we have another round, the second year of the Yarr Leadership Academy that will be happening this year. Ironically, both Abbey and Dan were in the first session. So you're also kind of seeing the Leadership Academy in action today, I suppose. But the Leadership Academy focuses all on exploring the roles and opportunities for patient representation in policymaking, therapy development, regulatory review, and the access environment. It's all about the kinds of roles and spaces where the patient perspective really matters and where patients can have a lot of sway over some of that decision making. Something like, for example, how medications are reviewed in this whole process that you've heard some about today. And the Leadership Academy is structured as an 8-week online course. It's once a week for a few hours with different expert speakers every week from one of these spaces and some of these responsibilities. There are also assignments to pre-read and assessments throughout to work on. And folks at the end will do a capstone project where they create a mock application to one of these roles that they would want to be a patient representation in. So the applications for the Leadership Academy will open online on Tuesday, July 12th. You can email with any questions, and those will stay open through Friday, August 5th. The course will run through September through November before Thanksgiving. So those are where the 8 weeks are coming in. This is Abby and Dan's contact information for folks who really want to follow up with them separately on any questions from today. I encourage you especially to take a picture of this or screenshot this to be able to remember the information. These lovely folks are sharing their knowledge with us and have kindly offered contact information to follow up. So definitely, if you have any questions or other opportunities, feel free to follow up with them. I'm going to pass it back over to them in a second to answer any questions and talk a little bit more. So I really encourage you all, if you have any questions, whether clarifying or you want more information about something or just an overview, maybe of what it was like to research PDUFA or what this process is currently sort of undergoing, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box and we can try to get to as many as possible before the end. And then if you have any questions about anything else we said or anything Yarr overall, please feel free to take a picture of this slide as well. This is some of our social media and then both my email address and Lindsay's email address. Either or both of us would be happy to chat more about anything that has come up today. Any questions you might have about any of this, joining Yarr, some of the opportunities we mentioned. So with all of that, I'm going to pass it back off to questions. I'm actually going to get started with a kind of fun question because I think it might open. Abby, you hinted a little bit towards something that you were really excited about with PDUFA, the fact that every 5 years you can re-engage with it. I'm really interested in what maybe either of you found unexpected in the process or like a really cool tidbit that you discovered along the way of doing your research that you didn't know before. Like what was something where you're just like, oh, like that's kind of neat, or that's an interesting policy design as you were putting together your slides for this?
Yeah, so I'd say the most interesting thing I ever learned about PDUFA was actually taught in the Yarr Leadership Academy. It has nothing to do with rare disease, but it has to do with the importance of why it's reauthorized every 5 years and kind of how it goes with the changing times, I guess, is that the PDUFA that came out the year right after 9/11 actually involved some policy that had to do with bioterrorism, because it was kind of on the forefront of what we talked about that year, kind of like how what happened in the pandemic is happening with our current PDUFA. And that stood out to me. And I don't know why that's still a fact that like I still remember someone sharing, but that just always stood out to me and immediately showed me the benefit of why we have to reauthorize it every 5 years, even though it seems like such a slog. So really random fun fact, but that's always stood out. Dan, do you have any fun facts that you learned?
Yeah, I learned a lot throughout the research, which I always found very interesting about PDUFA. And I think just kind of the process of how it took to be the case, I just think the fun fact about PDUFA is the idea of like seeing the process of it every 5 years, and that sense of like what needs to be needed at that time. So I think it was interesting, like seeing the 3 years and then realizing, oh, the lifetime. I think that's fascinating. I think the fun fact about it as well is just realizing the context of it is that PDUFA, it might be this one policy, but it took decades and different other ideas concerning user fees as a whole to really reach its full potential. And I think that's something that's very fascinating, is that it's just never a cut and dry thing. There's always this history and context of things, and exploring that is so fascinating.
Those are both just really cool answers. We have another question in the chat that I'll just pose to both of you, which is, can you point us towards some more resources where we could read more about PDUFA? Anything you all used in your research or just found helpful?
I specifically, for the current ones, used a lot of the FDA's website because that's where they're updating a lot of their most recent information. But I've also learned a lot. This sounds like a self-plug here, but everything that the EverLife Foundation has put on, so the recorded RDLA webinar that just happened this month or last month, I don't know what month it is. There's one on PDUFA that we covered, the rare disease congressional caucus briefing. Once that is posted, was all about PDUFA. And that included a lot of like high level information, but a lot of really good slides that I took notes while I was watching, but I even like took pictures of the slides and like went back and like actually absorbed the information quicker than it was shared. And that's just shared by like experts that are in it, and they're putting together these slides. And sometimes that's a lot easier than having to read through like congress.gov to figure out what's actually in this bill, or reading I mean, you could read the entire 182-page draft if that's really interesting to you, but hearing from like leading experts, I think was how I developed a lot of this knowledge. And I really recommend everything that the Every Life Foundation has put out, but you can also just Google like PDUFA VII webinars, and there are some other organizations that have put some on as well.
Yeah, in terms of the historical aspect as well, if you ever are interested in that, the FDA website was also my first great resource as well. That was actually talking about that. They referenced the 2 Supreme Court cases, and I actually had to find them, which was a very big struggle. That took, I think, a solid half hour to an hour of searching throughout like any of the stuff, because they referenced 2 Supreme Court cases in 1974. Looking through those cases, and then also just kind of like Abby mentioned, if you want to be more up to date, the Congress websites, it is a little bit of a long read, but if you're ever interested, I definitely recommend it. And if you're ever bold to read the Grace Commission and the original idea of how user fees could be implemented, if you have time to sit down and read 21,000 pages, go for it. I recommend it. I haven't gotten there yet, but I want to go.
I think that this is about to be my next summer beach read, is specifically the 21,000 pages. But I will also note, Abby's being a little modest and did moderate the Rare Disease Congressional Caucus, which was a lovely but much higher level deep dive into PDUFA. And Lindsay's adding a bunch of these links into the chat for folks who might want to open them in the background or just bookmark them to have. Also, feel free to keep adding questions into the Q&A about anything. There's no such thing as too specific or too clarifying a question. Like, please, if you have things, feel free to ask. I also, like Abby, you hinted at this a little bit. I also wanted to ask you, Dan, on the history side, like if there was just one sentence, 1 to 2 sentences that you could like tell people like, hey, this is how you can pitch why PDUFA is important to like your friends, your family members, this 4th of July, like how would you sort of describe all of that in the process? Like get them to care about it, get them to want to do things with that.
I would sell it in the sense of PDUFA the idea of it, you may not know every single fact of it, but it is the reason why there are drugs for people and that you may know in the rare disease community, for drugs that even if you're not in the rare disease community, it may be the reason why you have these drugs that are making your life a little easier, that are helping you through it. And I think that's something that we have this time and action to advocate to get it done, as well as add new things that are important for the now, while also looking forward to the future, trying to get things passed right now and looking 5 years in the future on what we may need, what things might come up. And that's something that it's good to look on the grand scale as well, which is awesome, but also looking at the small scale and the micro of looking at your friend or someone you're in a relationship with, or your mom or your dad or anything like that, that they're taking medicine or drugs or anything that may have been attributed to PDUFA being passed is so vital.
Thank you so much. We're basically at 7, so I just want to note, we have one quick last question and then we can sort of close out. What do we think the obstacle being faced from adding the language of the STAT Act and the Benefit Act to PDUFA VII is in terms of trying to add that in? We can try to answer this a little bit. Obviously, it's complicated because it's also in motion.
From what I've understand, a lot of it is just the Center of Excellence has always been a little bit of a polite struggle to get through at the FDA. So it's kind of not a surprise that it's not language that they're going to potentially successfully get into this one, but there is other specific language from the STAT Act that we are trying to get into these future drafts that might not be the Center of Excellence, but have to do with some of the same key aspects of that STAT Act, because there's more than just that Center of Excellence involved in it. But that's one of the bigger ones, is that's been like a pretty big pushback at the FDA right now. So that's not surprising to me that it was a little bit harder to get put into this one on both sides, because it needs to get added to both and then into the final, which is a lot of steps, which is why it may end up sticking around. But I think that's, from what I've heard, is one of the bigger reasons why specifically that one is. The one in the Benefit Act, I'm not quite as familiar with as to why it didn't make it in, or why that specific language we were looking for didn't make it in. But I can always look it up and get back to you, Amelia.
And I will also note, like for folks who are coming to Rare across America, like the STAT Act and the Benefit Act will continue to sort of be legislative asks that we're working on and that are rare disease community priorities. So especially for the folks who have done anything with the STAT Act policy campaign, like if you really care about this and like this is really the issue that you want to push for, like there will also continue to be movement around that in various different ways. I also just want to note someone in the chat was saying a huge thank you and fabulous job to both of you, which I think is a lovely note to close out on because you both did such a like fantastic job describing these things, answering questions. If people do have follow-ups, the recording will be posted to go back and also contact information. Feel free to follow up with both speakers and anyone on the Yarr side. But thank you so much for taking like an hour of your evening to come hear about PDUFA, such an important topic. And like seriously, like thank you all for your advocacy. So with that, I think we're going to close out and come to the next few summer series.